everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today we are doing my May wrap up. I'm so confused what month we're in, but this is my May wrap up, all the books that I read in May. So I read 5 books in May, which is doing better than last month where I read like 1. So feeling good about May, and I did enjoy some books. I had some books that I felt very like complete neutrality about, and some books that I really loved. So let's just get into it. So the first 2 books that I read were actually contemporary YA, which is not usually what I read a lot, but kind of at the end of April, I reread the first 2 Heartstopper graphic novels by Alice Oseman because I had watched the Heartstopper Netflix adaptation and was enjoying just like being in that world. And then I was like watching a bunch of videos that were about Heartstopper, and someone mentioned that there is a novella called Nick and Charlie that is about Nick and Charlie from Heartstopper, and I hadn't realized that there was a actual like non-graphic novel book that was about them. So I listened to the audiobook for Nick and Charlie. So that takes place a few years after the graphic novels, that it is Nick's last year in their school, and he's about to graduate and go to university. And so it's really about kind of like, where are they in their relationship and what is that going to mean for them. Nick is very excited about going to university. Charlie's kind of feeling left behind, and just the friction that causes in their relationship, and them kind of figuring out like, what is this going to mean for us? So it's a very quick novella. It was like maybe a 2-hour audiobook, but I really enjoyed it. It was interesting to read about them in a different format because it definitely had a very different feel from the graphic novel. It felt a little bit older than the graphic novel, and like that could be for a lot of different reasons. One, they're older because this is at least like a year or 2 after the events of the graphic novels. It could also just be because I was listening to the audiobook and the narrators, are adults who are narrating it, so their voices sounded older, and the narrators did a good job, but while I was listening to it, I was kind of like, this is not what I imagined your voice would sound like. But yeah, I think that maybe the format just kind of lends to that. It just like felt a little bit older than the graphic novels, and it also didn't have like the very cute art style of the graphic novels to like add to the like light cuteness factor of it. But I did really enjoy it, and I gave it 4 stars. After that, I was continuing on with this feeling of wanting to read more kind of in this contemporary world of Alice Oseman's. So I read Solitaire, which is about Charlie's older sister, Tori. And in Solitaire, there are kind of like 2 parts to the story, I guess. Tori as a character is a little bit of an outsider. She has a hard time really like relating to other people and like connecting with other people. And like she does have a small group of friends, but she still very much feels like an outsider. But this year in her school, there are some new students coming in, 2 of which are boys who are kind of trying to befriend her, and she's very like unsure how to handle this, and also kind of confused because she's like, I don't talk to anybody. Why are you trying to be friends with me? So that is part of the story where there are these kind of new people in her school who are sort of disrupting her usual way of doing things day to day, and maybe pushing her to think about herself and people and relationships a little bit differently. The other like part of the plot is that there's this either person or group of people called Solitaire who is pulling pranks at her school, and then they have a blog where they like document it and post about it, and kind of give hints to what they're going to be doing next. And so Tori is kind of trying to figure out like who is Solitaire and why are they doing what they're doing, but that's not necessarily like a real driving force of the story, I feel like. So overall, while I was reading this, Like, I did enjoy the books, or the book, and I liked the characters. I feel like there were, for my taste at least, too many pop culture references. It just tends to feel to me like the author is trying too hard to be relatable. While I was reading this though, I just kept having the feeling that I was like, what is the point of this book? Like, what am I supposed to be focusing on or caring about? Because it's not clear to me. Because like the plot of Solitaire, like who is Solitaire? Why are they doing what they're doing? All of that, I guess, is like the plot of the book, but it doesn't really feel like it's the main focus of the story. And I don't feel like the characters put a lot of time or effort into trying to figure it out, so it feels a little bit like, why is this here, and how much am I supposed to care about this? And I guess like Tori as a character is supposed to be the main focus of the story, like her growing and changing and learning more about herself and relationships and all of that is supposed to be the center of the story. But like, I don't know, I also just felt like that wasn't necessarily done in a way that felt like it was really the focus of it. And as much as I did like Tori as a character, I didn't like her so much that I felt like it didn't need a plot. So I ended up feeling kind of like lackluster about it. I gave it 3 stars. It wasn't bad. There was nothing that was like specifically wrong with it, and I wasn't mad about it or anything. I think it's gonna be very forgettable. Like, it's not something that's gonna stick with me at all. After that, I read Crossings by Alex Landrigan. So this is sort of a literary historical fiction. I don't know. It is a book about books, or book like story about stories, like kind of thing. So the way this starts is that we are following, in the preface at least, a bookbinder who has a patroness that gives him manuscripts to bind in fancy ways. And at the beginning, she gives him a new manuscript that is 3 short stories put together that she asks him to bind on the condition that he doesn't read it. And he agrees to this, but then things happen so that he ends up deciding that the deal is off and he can actually read the book. And so he does, and then he binds it, and that's what the rest of this book is. So all of that happens just in the preface of the book. The rest of the book is those 3 short stories that he has bound together. Now, the thing that's like interesting about these is that, so each of these short stories has like a slightly different genre to them. Like, one of them is the sort of noir, like World War II historical fiction, and one of them is more like a fantasy about this island where there are people who have like mind powers. But what's interesting is that there are kind of 2 different ways to read this book. One is the conventional way, where you just read it cover to cover. So you read each individual short story. In this way, they are very loosely connected to each other. Like, one of the short stories references like, oh yeah, that's a book that exists in this world. But the other way is to read the Baroness sequence, which has you kind of jumping around between the 3 short stories and weaves the 3 stories together. So I read it as the Baroness sequence because I wanted to see how these 3 stories were woven together. I also personally am not super into short stories, so I thought I would just enjoy it more if it was one cohesive story. And I've seen a couple of reviews kind of saying that like the Baroness sequence is the way to go. And I would agree with that. I would say that it probably is best to read it as the Baroness sequence, or if you're curious, like you could read it both ways and see, but I would not recommend reading it only in the conventional way. Overall, what did I think of this? So for me, when I was reading this, the tone of this book was kind of exactly what I was in the mood for at the time. So I really enjoyed that about it, that it was just like exactly what I wanted right then. As a book though, I was pretty like underwhelmed by it. I think that the setup and structure of it is really interesting. I think that in general it does a pretty good job of weaving all of these stories together. There are points in the story in which I kind of wish that it had been maybe a little more tightly woven together, that the connections between the stories were clearer. It's a little like difficult because I both feel like there were time jumps that made it hard to like care as much about the characters because there were large pieces of like chunks of time that we missed, and then were just sort of narrated back to us of like, yes, let me tell you my story. This is what happened to me in these years that you missed. So I found that kind of difficult, and yet I also felt like there was too much information in this, like that there were chunks that could have been taken out. So I kind of was like, there's both too much and too little in it. So I think there's something about like the balance of what information was being focused on and like how it was being delivered that wasn't quite clicking for me. I think that I would have wanted the stories to be a little more tightly woven together, and for the characters to be a little bit more developed, I guess. This was kind of a strange book. It was okay. I gave it 3 stars in the end because I was like, I think that the premise and structure and idea of it is interesting, and I think it did do a lot of what it intended to do, and it did do an interesting job of like weaving some of these stories together. But I also was like, it was fairly lackluster for me overall. It's not one that I'm going to specifically like think about or remember. I'm not going to reread it. I don't know. It's also like, I love this cover so much, so I'm kind of debating whether I want to keep the book just for the cover, or if I should unhaul it. But if this like premise of like these different woven together stories sounds interesting to you and you want to read something like that, I really liked Arcadia by Ian Pierce. That it has a little bit of a similar structure in that it has these sort of different storylines that you're following that are different genres. There's like a historical fiction, there's like a fantasy, there's a sci-fi one, and they're all kind of like woven together. And I think that one was done much more successfully, and I really enjoyed that one. So if either you read this and were kind of underwhelmed by it, or just think the premise of it sounds interesting, I would recommend Arcadia by Ian Pierce. Anyway, okay. So after that, what did I read? After that, I read a book that I really enjoyed, which was Spear by Nicola Griffith. So this is a gender-bent queer Arthurian retelling specifically focused on Percival. When I first got this, for some reason I thought that it was about the Lady of the Lake. But it's not. It has like maybe some connections to her, but it's not actually like about the Lady of the Lake. But in this, we start out following a young unnamed girl who is living out in the woods with her mother. We know that her mother has something in her past that she has escaped from and that she is hiding from still, which is why they live alone in the woods. They don't really interact with other people, and her mother has like magical wards over them so that people won't find them. But our main character, you know, as she grows up, becomes curious about the outside world. She finds other people to observe, to kind of learn more about the world. And she decides that that she is meant to become one of King Arthur's knights. So she teaches herself to fight. She finds a horse and some gear and armor and kind of patches things together and starts to make her way to Camelot. And along the way tries to like make a name for herself. And then she also has a some kind of like magic where she's able to like speak to the wind and also like communicate with animals and things like that. So she has some amount of nature magic, and that helps her when she is fighting. So it will, like, the wind will tell her things about, like, you know, her enemy's weakness or something like that. So it helps her be a better fighter. So that is something that kind of, like, I think could kind of go either way for people when they're reading this, that some people could find it frustrating because it kind of makes her too good at everything. But it also gives it this real feeling of, like, this is a legend, and it has this very, like, legend-like feel to it, in the way that the magic works, the tone of the story, and in the writing. And sometimes books that have that really, like, that feeling of like a legend or a fairy tale and have a little bit of like distance to them don't always work for me, but I think that it just worked really well in this. I loved the atmosphere of this. I loved Nicola Griffith's writing. This is the first book I've ever read from her, and I just loved her writing. It was so atmospheric. Like, the book had such a strong feel to it. I just filmed a review for this, so that either is going up, it's either the video before this or right after this will be a review for this. If it's already up, I will link it in the description if you want to see. But yeah, I gave this 4.5 stars. I rounded it up to 5 stars because this is just so, I just enjoyed it so much, and I'm so excited to read more from her because it is rare for me to find an author that I'm like this excited about their writing. Okay, and then the last book that I read in May was, for some reason I feel out of breath today. What am I doing? Okay, so the last book that I read in May was Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty. So this is the third and final book in the Daevabad trilogy. And I can't say too much about this because, one, it's the third book, and two, it gets very complicated at a certain point. But in the first book, City of Brass, we start out in 18th century Cairo following Nahri, who wants to be trained as a doctor, but because she is a woman, at that time she is not able to be, and so in order to make a living she is a con artist. One day when she is doing one of her cons, she conducts a ritual which she thinks is a fake ritual but is actually a real ritual, and she ends up summoning a Jinn warrior who then realizes that in order to summon him she must have magic, and so he whisks her away to the city of Daevabad, which is a magical city that mortals do not know about. And when she gets there, she gets involved in all of the magic and politics and rebellions and uprisings and just all of the strife and struggles of Daevabad, because it is at a kind of critical tipping point in its political history. And things get very complicated from there. But I have been loving this series. The first book in the series I liked but wasn't like that excited about, but then earlier this year I read the second book and loved it, and then just immediately wanted to read the third one, and I have just been loving the rest of this series. I think that one of the things that I like, there are so many things I like about this. One, Nahri is a healer. She both is like a practical healer, like that she, you know, wanted to be trained as a doctor, but she also has healing magic, which I love. But also I think this world is so interesting and well written. I think the political dynamics of the world are really well written in a way that just, it rings very true in the way that they are written, and they are very complicated. But I just think the world is so interesting. But really, I love the way that all of the characters are written in this. I think they are well written because with each of the characters, you can understand why each character has done what they have done, because, you know, we're following multiple characters that kind of all end up on different sides of these conflicts. So you understand why each person has done what they have done, but you also understand why each person hates the other person for what they have done. Like, you understand all of their perspectives, and for most of the characters, there isn't anyone who is like wholly right or wholly wrong. There are a lot of people that you're like, you're kind of right and also kind of wrong. Like, you just so much understand where everyone is coming from. And I just love how they're written and like the complexity, and it just feels very true to how things are, is that, like, you know, no one is setting out to be an evil person. People are doing their best and doing what they think is right, and sometimes that seems very wrong to other people and sometimes harms people in the process and all kinds of things. I just think they're so well written, and I just enjoyed them so much. It was so good. I think this was a really good conclusion to the series. And yeah, there's a collection of short stories set in this world that I also want to read. I'm not usually a short story person, but because I have enjoyed this world and these characters so much, I'm very excited to just read more about it, so I'm going to be reading that collection. And I gave this one 4.5 stars, but this one I rounded down to 4 stars on Goodreads. My rating system doesn't always make sense, but sometimes there's a 4.5 that rounds up to 5, and sometimes there's a 4.5 that rounds down to 4. It's just a feelings-based rating system. But those are all of the books that I read in May. I am so glad that I ended the month on a high note, and I'm really excited to read more from those two authors. But I would love to know what you've been reading. What did you read in May, or what was your favorite thing that you read in May? But thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!